Hi, I'm Corey Cusimano. Thanks for coming to my CogSci talk. You just saw a mugging, and we often say of people in those sorts of situations, when they're coerced or under duress, or when they're just in very difficult situations, that they lack a certain kind of freedom, that the person in that situation could not have done otherwise. Today I'm going to present some work that I did with Natalia Zarilla, David Danks, and Tanya Lombroso, investigating how people come up with these sorts of judgments. And we're going to offer an account upon which people think that others cannot do otherwise based on how they think about how mental states are formed in the normal process of reasoning. But before we do that, we should analyze the situation that you just saw in a little more detail.
Consider the poor victim you saw hand his backpack over to the mugger. Although handing over one's expensive belongings for free is often a bad idea, in this situation it was clearly rational. First, his desire to preserve his life is stronger than his desire to protect his bag, and it would be irrational for him to value his bag over his life. Second, he believed that handing over the bag was the only way to protect his life. This belief was also rational. The evidence he had suggested that the mugger was dangerous. In light of these rational attitudes, the victim's intention to hand the bag over is also rational.
We know from many studies that people interpret other people's behavior by assuming that they're rational and by trying to figure out what a rational person would do in any given situation. So we can assume that most people would interpret the scenario in the way that I just did. But what this means is that, in effect, to ask if the victim in the situation could have done otherwise is really to ask if he could have behaved irrationally instead of rationally.
What if, in that moment, the victim wished that he had different attitudes? For instance, that he wished that he wanted to protect his bag more than his life. Could he get himself to adopt this irrational desire? Likewise, what if he wanted to believe that the mugger was not dangerous instead of believing, in line with the evidence, that he is dangerous? Could he choose to adopt that irrational belief? If he could adopt either of these attitudes, then he could form an alternative intention and act differently. But if he's incapable of believing and desiring other than how he does, then he would be unable to form a different intention and so unable to do otherwise.
We hypothesized that in ordinary circumstances, people think others are unable to adopt blatantly irrational beliefs and desires, and that this explains why people think that individuals in the mugging scenario are unable to do otherwise. However, our theory relies on a very specific way that people conceptualize the process of mental state change. See, another way that people might in theory make these sorts of judgments is by relying on a very simple heuristic. That is, people might realize that some behavior or attitude is irrational to form, and then just have a knee-jerk reaction that suggests they think it's impossible or difficult for them to form. On such a theory, people are engaging in a kind of attribute substitution, where they substitute the question of what somebody's capable of doing with the question of what they think they ought to do. As we'll explain now, we think that people's judgments are a little more nuanced than this.
Specifically, we hypothesized that people's judgments about others' ability to change their minds relies on a lay theory of reasoning that has two important properties. First, reasoning produces new mental states, like beliefs and desires, rationally. And second, reasoning is encapsulated and protected from people's direct intervention. That is, people are not able to interfere with the reasoning process, say by overriding the outputs of reasoning merely because they want to. So for instance, when someone becomes aware of some new evidence, observers think that they will form beliefs that rationally reflect that evidence, and moreover, that the person cannot then simply choose to believe against the evidence. Likewise, when presented with options, observers should judge others as uncontrollably desiring those options in a way that rationally reflects how good or bad they are. This proposal makes clear predictions about when people should think others are and are not capable of adopting irrational attitudes. Once someone has become aware of some information and reasoned about it, people should judge that person as unable to directly, intentionally override that judgment. However, people should judge others as capable of adopting irrational attitudes when they think that those others can manipulate the inputs to reasoning. If someone has control over their conscious access to reasons, then they can adopt or maintain any attitude they want, whether it is irrational or rational.
To test these predictions, we ran an experiment where we described people in situations similar to the mugging scenario and then asked participants to tell us if they thought that the character in that situation could change their beliefs and desires. For instance, in one scenario, a ship captain is sailing off into sea and has to decide if he's going to sail through a storm or return back to port. In another scenario, a college student is waiting to hear back if she won a scholarship that would pay for part of her tuition. We used a total of 4 scenarios, and participants were randomly assigned to read one of them.
All scenarios shared a few key features. First, the character forms a reasonable belief and desire in their situation. For instance, the ship captain believes that there is a storm descending and he wants to avoid sailing into it. We manipulated 2 features of each scenario. First, we manipulated the evidence that the character has for their belief. For instance, in the weak evidence condition, the captain believes that there is a storm based on a report from a weather station he knows to be unreliable. In the strong evidence condition, however, the weather station that issues the storm warning is famously reliable. We also manipulated how bad the relevant outcome in the scenario would be. In the bad outcome condition, the captain's boat is outfitted for hard weather, so the storm would be unpleasant but not catastrophic. But in the very bad outcome condition, the boat is in disrepair and it would sink if it was caught in a storm. We crossed these manipulations and participants were randomly assigned to one of the 4 variants of the scenario.
After reading the scenario, participants reported how easy or difficult it would be for the main character to change their beliefs and desires. But if beliefs and desires are primarily the result of rational reasoning, then they should think that merely because the character wants to change their beliefs and desires, they shouldn't be able to. And moreover, if people think that reasoning is constrained by rationality, then it should be more difficult to change one's mind when doing so becomes more and more irrational. For instance, it should be more difficult for somebody to change their belief when it violates a lot of strong evidence compared to when it violates weak evidence. And likewise, it should be more difficult for somebody to desire a very bad outcome compared to just a bad one. And all of this should be especially true when the only way that the character could try to change their mind is through normal reasoning. However, we predicted that the constraints of strong evidence or really bad outcomes would disappear if participants thought that the character could effectively manipulate the inputs to their reasoning. However, hijacking one's reasoning in order to adopt an irrational attitude is itself still highly irrational. So if people were answering these questions just by saying what they thought would be good or bad for the character to do, then they should say that this would be an equally bad way to try to change one's mind. However, we thought that even though hijacking one's reasoning in this way would result in similarly irrational attitudes, people would nevertheless say that it was effective.
We tested these predictions by asking participants to report how easily the character could change their mental states based on one of 2 kinds of strategies. Take, for example, the ship captain who wants to believe that he will not get caught in a storm. The first tactic participants rated involved him simply thinking about what to believe. The second tactic participants rated involved him performing an act that would cause him to forget the evidence that he had for his belief. Specifically, participants reported how easy or difficult it would be for him to adopt the opposing belief by taking a pill that would cause them to forget his evidence. In the desire condition, this tactic involved intentionally forgetting information about the utility of the outcome. Participants reported both kinds of strategies for both beliefs and desires in a counterbalanced order.
We collected data from 939 people from Prolific. Though our design fully crossed evidence and utility, I'm going to show you results that focus on how people conceptualize the constraints of evidence on belief formation, and then I'm going to show you results about how people conceptualize the constraints of utility on desire formation.
We will first look at the perceived impact of evidence on the character's ability to manipulate their beliefs. The y-axis represents ratings of how difficult it would be for the character to change their mind. So for instance, in the ship captain scenario, this would be how difficult it is for him to believe that there is no storm. Higher ratings mean it will be easier, lower ratings mean it will be more difficult. On the right are ratings from the weak evidence condition. This is the condition in which the captain's evidence for his belief comes from an unreliable source. And on the left are ratings from the strong evidence condition, when his evidence was reliable. Though I'm using the ship captain as an example, I'm presenting data that averages over all 4 scenarios. As predicted, when the evidence was stronger, participants thought it would be more difficult for the character to change their belief. However, this relationship between evidence and the ability to change one's mind completely attenuated when the character could easily intentionally forget their evidence. That is, when one can effectively manipulate one's reasons, the strength of reasons no longer affects one's ability to change one's mind. And here it means the character becomes more capable of believing something irrational. We observe the same predicted pattern of findings for the impact of utility on desire change. The right column shows results from the bad outcome condition, such as when piloting into the storm is not especially dangerous. The left column presents results from the very bad outcome condition, such as when the boat would fall apart under the pressure of a strong storm. When the character can only think about what they want, they are less able to want something associated with a very bad outcome compared to just a bad outcome. And just as for evidence and belief, the impact of utility on the character's capacity to change their desire attenuated or slightly reversed when they could easily intentionally forget how bad the outcome would be. These results verify all of our predictions. Merely wanting to change one's mind is insufficient to do so. Strong reasons prevent irrational belief and desire change, but they do not do so when the agent can manipulate their reasoning or forget their reasons, even though that would also be irrational.
Let's recap. We've argued that people think that others are constrained by rationality, such that it's more difficult for people to form mental states that violate rationality as opposed to conform to it. In our experiment, somebody thought that it was more difficult to adopt a belief that went against strong evidence than it was to adopt a belief that didn't. And likewise, participants thought that if somebody knew that a particular outcome would be really bad for them, they thought it would be really difficult for that person to want that outcome to occur. These results suggest that people not only think of others as typically being rational, but also that there are at least parts of other people that are uncontrollably rational. We also argued that it is the process of reasoning itself that people think is constrained by rationality. So, participants only thought that others were constrained by strong evidence or really bad outcomes, when the only way that the character could try to change their mind was through reasoning alone. By contrast, when participants thought that the character could manipulate their reasoning, and specifically manipulate the inputs to their reasoning by, say, intentionally forgetting the relevant information, participants thought that those characters were now equally capable of adopting irrational and rational attitudes. We think that these results help explain why people think others lack freedom in the kinds of mugging scenarios that we showed you at the beginning of the talk. Classic cases of coercion or situational pressure seem to operate by tightly constraining what it is rational for someone to think and want in that situation. Moreover, in these situations, people often must make decisions quickly, and so lack the opportunity to manipulate their reasoning or change their attitudes in other indirect ways. In follow-up work we've conducted, we found that perceived constraints on belief and desire seem to generate perceived constraints on intention formation and associated behaviors. And we've run additional studies ruling out some alternative interpretations of the results that I've shown you today. Please get in contact if you want to hear about any of this follow-up work. Finally, I'd like to thank my collaborators on this project, Natalia Zarilla, David Danks, and Tanya Lombroso, and thank you for watching.